All right, I think we're ready. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar of the Canadian Science Publishing and Society of Canadian Aquatic Sciences Early Career Researcher Reviewer Program. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jessica Reed, and I am a Journal Development Specialist at Canadian Science Publishing, or CSP for short. CSP is a not-for-profit publisher of 22 different science journals, including the Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences, as well as environmental reviews, which I help manage. I'm trained as a fish biologist, but have since moved into publishing, learning about new environmental science and connecting with the communities who do the research. Today I'm speaking to you from Tahumkuk, also known as Newfoundland, the unceded and traditional territories of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq. Many of you may be joining us from across Turtle Island or beyond, and have diverse relationships with the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, with whose homelands and waters you share. It's fortunate that we're gathering in October, a month that holds both the National Truth and Reconciliation Day, or Orange Shirt Day, to honor the lives lost and the continued impact of the residential school system. As well, this month holds National Indigenous Peoples Day. This is a good month and a reminder as a call to action, as we're both scientists and people, to think critically about how we respect and honor the species, ecosystems, and communities we work and live alongside, hoping to better ourselves and the research community so that working in the spirit of truth and reconciliation becomes an everyday practice and action. In the first half of this presentation, my colleagues will walk through different aspects of open science and peer review. Then we'll head into breakout rooms for 30 minutes to work through scenarios and examples together, and then we'll all come together at the end for discussion and Q&A. The lecture portion of this webinar will be recorded, but the breakout rooms and Q&A session won't be. My colleague Sylvia Hunter will be monitoring the Q&A for questions and comments, and a thank you to those as well who submitted questions at registration. We'll address them all at the end. I just wanted to get started with introducing the program that is joint between our two organizations that kind of kicked off this event. So in September, CSP and SCAS launched an early career researcher reviewer program for researchers and early professionals to gain insight and experience into the peer review process. The program aims to provide a collaborative environment where researchers are given an opportunity to peer review manuscripts submitted to the CSP and SCAS partner journals, the Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences, Canadian Journal of Zoology, Environmental Reviews, and Facets. As a participant of the program, you will enhance your understanding of peer review standards and processes, develop skills in the reviewing of scientific manuscripts, and help advance aquatic science in a meaningful way. There's still time to be part of the 2024 cohort, so if you're interested and you haven't signed up yet, we can paste a link in the chat where you can learn more information. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who will chat more about open science. Matt Swift joined CSP earlier this year after working in the publication ethics department at the open access publisher PLOS. And prior to this, he worked as a postdoc researcher in neuroscience and neuronal development at the University of Nottingham. He is currently the journal development specialist for botany and Arctic science at CSP. Take it away, Matt.
Thanks, Jess. So I'm just going to give an introduction to open science. So the way that researchers have shared their findings over the centuries has evolved somewhat dramatically. Early research wasn't actually intended to be read by non-scientists, and very famous scientists that we now celebrate, like Isaac Newton and Galileo, actually wrote in code, so their work couldn't be interpreted by by individuals who those scientists didn't want. And while journals did emerge sort of in the 17th and 18th centuries, it wasn't until the 20th century, in the 1950s, that the model that we have now with anonymous peer review really started to take precedence. And in the 1990s, with the evolution and development of the internet, the open access model was created, which essentially, for the first time, really made papers available to individuals outside university, so charities, hospitals, members of the public, and government and policymakers. And that's because open access publishing essentially makes the content free to read. And for a publisher perspective, for CSP, we see open access as a way to enhance the reach, rigor, and relevance of science, so that relevant people can find, trust, and use it. Traditionally, for a paper to be published open access, an article processing charge, or APC, is paid by the authors. But in the spirit of making things more equitable for authors, many publishers, including CSP, have been moving towards payment models that are funded by specific institutions. And while open access is undoubtedly an important way of making research as well, when you consider that a lot of research is funded by taxpayer money, it means that open science and open access means that this research becomes accessible. People started to think about how can we expand this concept even further. So the term open science was coined in 2011, and UNESCO's recommendation on open science is a great place to get a sense of what open science is all about. So from the recommendation by UNESCO, there are many helpful descriptors, starting with a definition. So open science is a set of principles and practices to make scientific research from all fields accessible to everyone for the benefits of scientists and society as a whole. It's a movement not only to ensure that multilingual scientific knowledge is accessible, but that the production of that knowledge is in itself inclusive and equitable. So that open science opens up the scientific process to those beyond traditional scientific communities. So again, if you think about how things were done in the past with, things being closed off via code, in the case of Galileo and Newton, moving it through to the 1950s, we're now in a much more different environment where data is accessible. So when we think about publishing a scientific research specifically, examples of open science can include open data in code, preprints, published or open peer review, article types like lab protocols or registered reports, and plain language summaries. Preprints aren't unique in as much as they've been around since the 1990s, well before the 2011 definition of open science existed. And there are currently a wide variety of subject-specific preprint servers. A popular one that for life sciences is bioRxiv, of course. CSP encourages preprint submissions to all of our journals. We also have a partnership with bioRxiv so that authors at Facets, which is one of the SCAS partner journals, can submit their preprint directly to the journals from the bioRxiv server itself. But for other journals, you can then submit to bioRxiv directly, and then once your manuscript is published, you can then link the two together on the bioRxiv site. Thinking more about open data, a number of publishers as well as funding agencies around the world have been moving towards a model of requiring open data. Some scientific societies and publishers are actually requiring open data as well. Open data generally means that data and code underlying the findings are accessible, reusable, and shareable. And the rationale behind this is that data sharing is good for research and researchers alike. It has a lot of benefits. It enhances the reproducibility of research, it promotes discoverability and collaboration, and fundamentally increases the trust, transparency, and reuse of research data. That said, not all data can and should be open. For example, sensitive data that can be used to identify vulnerable populations or individuals can't be considered for open data. And most institutional and funder policies mandate that the data should be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. And this means that open data is the default unless there are ethical, legal, or commercial restrictions. Before any research project begins, it's essential that everyone involved in the research project has conversations about data ownership and management. These are very important topics and do need discussing before any research is carried out. At Canadian Science Publishing, we support the FAIR principles for all papers that report data. You may know these guidelines, which were published in 2016, which aim to improve the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of digital assets. We also support the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance, which are often relevant to research published in our journals. These were developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance to complement the FAIR principles above, and while encouraging researchers to consider the people and purpose behind the data. Often in Canadian aquatic science research, Indigenous peoples, as well as Indigenous lands, territories, resources, knowledges, and geographical indicators are represented and identified within data. So I'd just like to introduce our next speaker, who will talk about authorship skills. This is Dr. Andrea Wishart. Andrea is a journal development specialist. for CJ, Canadian Journal of Forest and no, Canadian Journal of Zoology. And Andrea, if you'd like to take over.
Thanks so much, Matt. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to start off by chatting about the goal of academic writing. So why do we do this in the first place? So to consider what makes a high quality paper, we should really start by thinking about the goal of scientific writing, which is to communicate the findings of your research clearly so that your readers can understand what you did, why you did it, what you found, and what significance it might have for your research field and beyond. So we'll walk through a typical research paper today. All papers can differ somewhat in structure a little bit, but in general, you can ask yourself these core questions while peer reviewing to determine if they meet the criteria for publishing. You can also apply these questions to writing your own papers as you prepare to submit them to a journal to make sure it aligns with what other peer reviewers would be expecting. So the first question we'll address is, have the authors presented a clear research question? So no matter what type of study you're conducting, there should always be a clear research question. Papers are sometimes rejected because they present what some folks call a fishing experiment, where you can go out sampling or conduct experiments just to see whatever you find and then report on it. But the better practice is instead to develop a research question that you aim to answer through the course of your study. This is all laid out in the introduction part of your paper, where you can set the stage for what you came up with, why you came up with the research question with background information. You'd go into the literature to find out in the field what is known and what gaps exist in the current body of knowledge. This is where you'll demonstrate the new insights that your question will add to the field of research and how your contribution will expand the body of knowledge. Explaining this really well in the introduction is a key aspect of avoiding rejection from the get-go for lack of novelty. You don't want your work to merely be derivative of previous work, but instead be a clear, logical next step in the literature. Next, when we're looking at your paper, so after the method section, you should always describe what you're doing, but jumping right to the results, your results really should be reproducible. Your results of your efforts to answer your research question should be reproducible, and this is accomplished through clear reporting of your methods. So the methods section should provide enough detail so that another researcher could readily reproduce the results of your study. The methods should also be appropriate and truly test your hypothesis in a logical, sound way. The methods is also where you should describe ethics considerations, so things like experiments that involve animals or human participants, explaining ethical considerations and permits, including community engagement in here is a good idea as well. Throughout this section, you want to be clear enough so that reviewers and readers don't have any lingering questions or doubts about the solidity of your work, but of course, be concise. In a system where the most groundbreaking and click-worthy papers are often given priority, it seems, it can be tempting to overstate your conclusions. However, this makes for really poor science. Your conclusions of your study should only claim as much as shown by your data and your results. Your discussion section is where you should be linking your results and your assessment of your results to the existing literature to build and present a body of evidence to the reader, keeping in mind the research question you explicitly set out to study. So again, looping back to that initial research question and having that as a consistent thread throughout your work. You should present your conclusions relatively conservatively. For example, because of A, B, and C, we posit a theory whereby ... for example. Leave the speculation aspect to a section of future research. This could be a separate section with a subheader on its own, or perhaps it's just the last paragraph of your discussion. But that's where you should maintain the put a box around, in a way, your speculation and not have that woven out through your discussion section. Ensuring that there's a solid line of logic and reason from your background in the introduction and literature review leading into your research question. That means you've got logical methods to test that research question and that lead logically again to your results, and continuing to follow that logic when you're doing your interpretation and your discussion. This can all help ensure that you've written a very clear, reproducible piece of work that will be a valuable addition to the published literature. This is all really good to keep in mind when you're reviewing papers of what makes a good paper in the first place. So the next section on peer review is going to be presented by our Director of Peer Review at CSP, Dr. Natasha McDonald. Before she worked at CSP in academic publishing, she was a researcher in the field of ocean biogeochemistry. So I'll hand this over to you, Natasha.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea. All right. So this is our last segment before we go into our breakout rooms and start the interactive portion of the workshop. So we're going to continue talking a little bit more about peer review first. Let me just get to the next slide here. All right. So the first thing we kind of, to expand upon what Matt mentioned in the first part of the talk, is that peer review, as we know, it hasn't always existed. Scientific journals has been around for centuries, but it wasn't really until the end of the 19th century when we saw, manuscripts being reviewed only by an editor-in-chief of a journal, and the involvement of external peer reviews didn't really begin until the middle of the 20th century. And at first, the idea of sending a manuscript to anonymous reviewers was received not very well by even famous researchers. Einstein once infamously was infuriated because an editor-in-chief dared to send his research out for a second opinion, and he thought that that was very offensive. But of course, as you know, today peer review is quite common. But of course, there's some tips to doing it well. So as a peer reviewer, there are some things you can control and there's things you can't. So the main things that are out of your control, at least to a certain extent, are when and where, when and for which journal you get asked to review. You have a little bit of control over that in that you can reach out to journals, you can sign up and register for reviewer programs such as this program. And then you have a little bit more of a say in terms of who's asking you to review. The other things that you can control, though, are your own time management and whether you say yes or not, your behavior and tone, being aware of and recognizing your own bias, and doing your homework and being prepared and networking, like I mentioned, in order to get asked to review the right things. So some key things to keep in mind when you're a reviewer is to know your role. So your role is to determine whether the author's claims are supported by the findings that they've reported in their study, to help journal editors make their decision and give that expert opinion. And also as an aside, you don't have to be an expert on every single aspect of the paper, and we'll get into that a little bit more, especially in the breakout session. You don't have to be a copy editor. That is not your role as an editor, as a reviewer, and it's probably not the best use of your time. If you notice language or grammar or typo issues, you just need to leave a note that the manuscript might benefit from copy editing. Your goals as a reviewer are, like I said, to provide an expert opinion to the journal. And this is one that I think reviewers sometimes tend to forget, is to help authors improve. It's to make scientific research better, more replicable and more reliable, and to give the kind of feedback that you'd like to receive if you were the author. And for those of you who have gone through the review process yourself with papers you've submitted, it can be pretty crushing when a reviewer is less than kind. So be humble, transparent, and critical, but constructively critical. Respect everyone's time, so the editor's time, the author's time, and your own time, and communicate with the journal if anything comes up. So if you spot an issue, maybe you need more time, whatever might come up, feel free. You should be encouraged to contact the journal or the editor. And again, and we're going to talk about this a bit more, be aware of your potential biases, and also be confident. There's a reason that you were asked to review, so believe in yourself. So when you're responding to an invitation, imagine a scenario where an editor has found your name, identified you as an expert reviewer. So step one is responding to the invitation. So you might be thinking to yourself, should I say yes or no? Some of the things to ask yourself are, first of all, do you have the right expertise? Is this too far out of your field to be able to provide that kind of detailed opinion? Do you have the time right now? So deadlines are usually quite tight, And so there might be a paper that you might really want to review, but you have a grant proposal that's due, you have teaching, responsibilities. It might just not be the right time for you. And it's okay to decline. And when you do that, you can let the journal know, I can't do this right now, but hey, please invite me for future ones. And can you be objective? Let's say this is something that maybe is a little too close to home, and you know that because you use a certain method, you are going to be just incapable of being unbiased about another study that's using a different method. Peer review invitations usually arrive by email, so read the email carefully. It has all the information you should need there. The title and abstract are usually sent along there as well, and those are going to tell you about the article's topic, research topic, and it'll have the deadline in there as well. So ask yourself, do you want to review the article? Do you have time? Do you know enough about the topic? And as I mentioned, can you be objective? So if you're not sure that you can be fair, you can decline the invitation, but you can always reach out to the journal or the editor and discuss it with them. So we talk about competing interests sometimes, and this is something that we all want to be aware of. So the most important thing is to declare any potential competing interests to the journal so that they can determine whether it might interfere with or could be reasonably perceived as interfering with the full and objective presentation, peer review, editorial decision-making, or publication of an article. So competing interests, they can be financial or non-financial, they can be professional, they can be personal, and they can arise in relationship to an organization or to another person. So things that we would typically look for are whether the two parties, for instance, an author or reviewer, are from the same institution, whether they have recent co-publications or any other discernible collaborations. And sometimes it's not possible for an editor to tell, so it operates on an honesty system, and these things usually come to light sooner or later. It's much better to declare your conflict of interest or potential conflict of interest at the beginning than once a manuscript is published. And rigorous peer review relies on everyone involved behaving responsibly and ethically, and CSP is a member of COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, and we encourage reviewers to become familiar with the ethical guidelines for peer reviewers, as well as the core responsibilities that we're going to outline. And we kind of have gone through this a little bit, but in terms of checking for competing interests, here's some questions that you can ask yourself. Again, could you profit or be negatively impacted financially by the submitted research? As I mentioned before, do you have a personal relationship with the authors? Are you and the authors rivals or competitors? Have you recently worked at the same institution? And these are, again, things to declare. So if you're declaring that the authors are working at DFO and you work at DFO and you're in a completely different province and you don't know them, then there's an excellent chance that the editor in a journal might come back and say, you know what, this is fine. So it's, again, more about declaring your potential conflict of interest than worrying too much about it. Are you currently collaborating with the authors? Have you published with the authors recently? Do you hold grants with them? These are all pretty common sense things that we just want our reviewers to declare because it helps us to get ahead of things. So ethical review, CSP journals currently all use single anonymous peer review. And so it's important that both the manuscripts under review and peer reviewer names remain confidential. Manuscripts are considered confidential while in peer review, so reviewers should hold in confidence these manuscripts that they're sent. They shouldn't share this information with other folks. If they have a question or they need to consult, they should do that with the journal office and the journal editors. They shouldn't use this information to gain in peer review to do anything to their own advantage. So if you, and it's horrible that this has happened, not here, I should stress, but if you, it would be unethical of you to take anything that is in an unpublished article that you're shown confidentially and to use that for your own research. It would be unethical to waive anonymity, or sorry, to break that anonymity, but you can always waive anonymity. So reviewers can sign their reviews by signing the comments to the authors. And to remain anonymous, all you have to do is ensure that you haven't uploaded in any of your comments and any of the review files, that these, including annotated manuscript PDFs, that you don't inadvertently disclose your name or your initials. And so this can happen by leaving, like I say, your name in the comments section or in the metadata for different documents. So just be careful with that. And reviewers should never communicate directly with an author unless agreed upon by the journal and the editor. That is a huge breach of the confidentiality of the peer review process. Reviewers can also disclose having reviewed for a journal or reviewing that manuscript for another journal, but they shouldn't specify the manuscript or the contents of the review, either before or after the peer review is complete. Also, if the editor has agreed, reviewers can co-review. And so we allow co-review at our journals. There is a section in the review form that asks you if someone helped you complete your review. So it could be your advisor. If you are a later stage in your career, it might be your PhD student. And we think that this is a great way for early career researchers and students to start to gain a little bit of experience in the review process. When you're writing your review report, remember that the purpose of the review is to get across your opinion about a manuscript quickly and have it understood by the editor and the authors. So you want to back up points you make with examples, and you can structure your review to make it really helpful, quick, and easy to understand. So typically you'd start off with a summary, your overall impression, which is the most important information. It shows that also that you understood the study. And it helped the editor understand your take on the manuscript. So there's nothing more confusing for the editor than a reviewer report, which just lists edits or flaws and doesn't actually say what you think of the manuscript overall. And then you're going to present your major findings, major issues that you have, and then minor ones, and give evidences and examples. And line numbers are typically very helpful for this. And then last, you can give any other points, any miscellaneous remarks or minor details or suggestions. And in practice, what you should write when you're writing your review. So as I said, using examples, don't just say it's good or bad. Provide that kind of helpful feedback that you as an author would like. Talk about what you liked and as well as what you had issues with. Don't talk about yourself and your research. And don't focus on small things like typos. Again, your job is not to be a copy editor. And also keep your recommendations bounded by the scope of the study in front of you, and don't provide recommendations on a decision in your actual review. You can provide those in confidential comments to the editor, because there's nothing more confusing and frustrating to an author is when a reviewer says, I recommend this, and for whatever reason, the editor goes with a different decision. This is kind of repeating what we said: be professional and respectful, be clear and concise, and structure your points so they're easy to follow. As I mentioned, refer to page and line and table and figure numbers, and write about the manuscript. Don't make it personal. Don't write about the authors, and keep in mind the author's perspective. Give examples, as I've mentioned, again, minor and major comments that you have and issues that you that have been raised. And when it comes to getting recognized for reviewing, there's a number of different ways. So all of you who are part of the new SCAS ECR reviewer board, this is a perfect way to get recognized for reviewing. There are other ways as well. You, even if you are reviewing anonymously, so the Web of Science Reviewer Recognition Service is one that you can sign up for. You can create a Web of Science researcher profile, and it lists and validates your peer review work while keeping you anonymous. And you can showcase your publications, citations, and other scholarly contributions. And then you can also get a score for your reviews, which editors and journal staff can see, but obviously will remain anonymous to authors. And finally, we wanted to provide you with some resources for writing and reviewing so that you can go through these. This is just a kind of a not comprehensive list of a number of different services. I will say that, oh, I don't see it on here. I was going to say that the PLOS Writing and reviewing centers are very helpful, and we can put those, I'd link to those in the chat for you before the end of the service, but these other ones are also, we can provide you with links to these in the chat, and you'll also get these slides at the end. And with that, we are going to go to our breakout rooms, but first I'll hand it back over to Jess.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think we are just going to split out into the breakout rooms, and then all of the presenters have a copy of their slides, so we can just work through presentations and materials that way. So please await your breakout room assignment. And again, those won't be recorded.